When Victoria Sloane pointed across the ballroom and told the head of security to remove himself from her line of sight, the entire charity gala seemed to hold its breath. She had mocked the patch on his uniform jacket, loudly questioned whether the hotel employed guards who understood their station, and announced to a table of energy executives that a man carrying a radio had no business standing anywhere near a room where $100 million decisions were made. Elliot did not argue. He straightened his jacket, adjusted the radio on his belt, and asked her calmly whether she still intended to sign the licensing agreement on Monday morning. Victoria laughed in a way that silenced the nearest tables. Then her own attorney walked through the ballroom entrance, scanned the room, found the face of the man she had just told to disappear, and felt the color drain from his own face entirely. The security guard she had dismissed as furniture was the only person alive with the authority to pull a $90 million deal before a single page was ever signed. Elliot Strand spent the afternoon before his evening shift the way he spent most of his free hours, sitting at the kitchen table with schematics spread in front of him while his 16-year-old daughter worked on her AP chemistry lab report at the other end. Maya Strand glanced up from her notebook and asked without much ceremony whether he thought the deal was actually going to happen this time. Elliot told her he thought it would, though he had learned years ago not to count on anything until ink was dry and the other party had already left the building. Maya said she hoped it happened soon, not because of the money, but because she wanted him to sleep past 5 in the morning again for once in his life. He had not slept past 5 in a long time. 4 years earlier, his wife Joanna had died of pancreatic cancer 11 months after diagnosis. The speed of it had left Elliot with the feeling that the ground beneath him had simply stopped being solid, and for a long time the only thing that made sense was the work directly in front of him. He had stepped back from his engineering position at a grid infrastructure firm to be home when Maya needed him, and the hotel security job had given him something steady and schedule-friendly that asked nothing of his grief except that he show up presentable and keep his eyes open. The job had never once made him feel small, because Elliot had never believed that a uniform determined what a person was worth. Clear pulse systems had grown out of those same quiet hours. Utility grids failed in patterns, and Elliot had spent enough years inside the industry to recognize anomalies before they cascaded into outages. He had started building the diagnostic platform late at night after Maya went to bed, using it at first as a way to keep his mind from going to places he couldn't afford for it to go. By the time the software was sophisticated enough to catch failures that conventional monitoring systems missed entirely, several large energy companies had begun expressing serious interest. He had never intended it to become a business. He had intended it to survive the years, and it had done that, and then quietly it had become something more. At the Hartfield Grand, the downtown Chicago hotel where Elliot had worked for 7 years, the staff regarded him the way people regard the person who keeps everything from going sideways, without ever announcing that they've done it. He handled the difficult situations nobody else wanted, covered shifts when younger staff called in short notice, and had never once spoken about his other life to anyone in the building. Dominic Ferraro, the hotel's owner, and a man who had known Elliot's late wife since they were children in the same South Side neighborhood, had always treated him as something closer to family than to an employee. And Elliot had always returned that trust by doing his job as well as he possibly could. It was Dominic who pulled him aside that afternoon and told him that Sloane Energy Group had requested the ballroom's VIP corridor for the evening. The event was a charity fundraiser for grid infrastructure in underserved rural communities, which Elliot noted silently was the kind of irony that arrived more and more often the older he got. The guest of honor was Victoria Sloane, the CEO of Sloane Energy, the executive whose legal team had spent 3 months in final stage negotiations over a ClearPulse licensing agreement worth $90 million. Elliot had insisted from the first conversation with his attorney, Paul Whitmore, that his identity remain undisclosed until the moment of signing. He had seen enough deals collapse under the weight of inflated expectations to know that the cleanest agreement was one concluded between parties looking at the terms, not at each other. Paul had called him that afternoon to confirm that Sloane's board had given full authorization at Thursday's session, and that only Elliot's signature remained between ClearPulse and the largest contract in the company's history. He slid the phone back into his jacket pocket, checked the ballroom schedule one more time, and went to work. Victoria Sloane arrived at the Hartfield Grand the way she arrived everywhere. Slightly ahead of the crowd she traveled with, and slightly louder than the room she entered. She complained about the placement of the VIP tables before she had crossed the ballroom floor, redirected two servers mid-task with a gesture rather than a word, and asked the assistant beside her whether Chicago hotels had always been this careless about details. The way a person might ask whether it always rained. Elliot watched from near the service corridor entrance and registered the texture of the energy she brought into the room. Not nervousness, not urgency, but something closer to entitlement as a permanent weather condition. When Elliot approached to inform her that the reserved entrance for the VIP corridor was to her left, Victoria Sloane looked directly through him the way some people look at elevator buttons. She handed him her coat without making eye contact and told him to see that it wasn't hung near anything damp. He took the coat without comment and passed it to the coat check attendant who was already waiting 6 feet away. Over the next hour, he watched her move through the room. She interrupted a junior staffer mid-sentence to demonstrate to the executives around her that she had noticed an error in the floral arrangement. She told Brendan Falk, her chief operating officer, loudly enough for two nearby tables to hear, that the people running service events in this city had no idea what a properly chilled bottle looked like. When a young server accidentally brushed against her chair while clearing a nearby table, she called for the floor supervisor and requested that the server be reassigned before he damaged anything important. Elliot stepped in and told the floor supervisor quietly that he had observed the incident and that the server had done nothing wrong. Victoria turned toward him for what felt like the first time, though what she actually looked at was the uniform. She asked how long he had worked at the hotel. Before he finished answering, she turned back to Brendan Falk and remarked that hotels which allowed security staff to insert themselves into service complaints were hotels that had stopped caring about the standards of their paying guests. Elliot said nothing. Later in the evening, while the formal program was still 40 minutes from beginning, Victoria positioned herself near a cluster of executives and spoke at a volume designed to carry. She said she had heard that ClearPulse's founder was the kind of man who had never held a real executive position, that the platform was impressive in narrow demonstrations, but had never been tested at genuine scale, and that she expected the Monday signing to be straightforward, because men who had spent their careers building things in quiet rooms tended not to know how to negotiate once they were sitting across from someone who did. Elliot stood near the corridor entrance and listened to this, without moving. It was when he gently corrected a factual error Brendan Falk made about grid monitoring latency, an error that touched directly on the technology. Victoria was 3 days from licensing, that her patience gave way entirely. She turned from her table and addressed him in a voice that made the nearest conversation stop. "Security doesn't negotiate contracts," she said. "Men in your position open doors. They don't close deals. Please go back to standing near the wall and let the people in this room do what they came here to do." The ballroom had gone quiet enough that the chandelier hum was audible. Elliot looked at her steadily and asked whether she was confident she wanted to proceed with the Monday agreement as scheduled. Victoria Sloane smiled the way people smile. when they're certain they're dealing with someone who doesn't understand how far beneath them they are. She told Brendan Falk that this was what happened when hotels employed security personnel without sufficient screening, and she told the room generally that she had once heard a maintenance man at a conference in Dubai try to give her investment advice, and that this situation had precisely the same quality. There was scattered laughter from people who wanted to stay on her good side. For the next 20 minutes, Victoria continued in a vein she seemed to find genuinely entertaining. She informed the executives around her that men who reached middle age in building security had generally made their peace with the ceiling above them. She suggested that the hotel's general manager might want to brief his staff on the distinction between attentiveness and overreach. At one point, she placed her room key on the nearest tray and suggested Elliot return it to the front desk, since that was perhaps a more suitable task for his skill level. Elliot picked up the key and set it on the tray of a passing server without a word. Dominic Ferraro, watching from near the kitchen entrance, had gone very still. It was Paul Whitmore who walked through the ballroom's main doors at 9:47, accompanied by Anna Weston, Sloane Energy's general counsel. Paul had come to finalize the last set of documents before the Monday signing. He crossed the ballroom, found Elliot standing with his arms at his sides, while Victoria said something that made Brendan Falk laugh, and Paul's expression moved through 3 distinct phases in the space of a second: recognition, confusion, and a kind of controlled alarm that Elliot recognized from the months they had spent together, building ClearPulse's legal protections. Victoria noticed Paul's arrival and waved him over. She pointed at Elliot and told him that she had been considering having the security detail replaced and that perhaps he could facilitate that given his familiarity with the hotel's management chain. Paul did not look at Dominic. He looked at Victoria Sloane. "Mrs. Sloane," he said carefully, "the man you're referring to is Elliot Strand." The name registered across her face like a word in a language she hadn't expected to hear spoken aloud in this room. Paul continued, because there was nothing to be gained from softening it, that Elliot Strand was the founder and sole owner of ClearPulse Systems, and the only individual on Earth with the authority to execute the licensing agreement her board had approved at Thursday's session. Anna Weston opened the folder she had been holding at her side, located the identification photographs attached to the front page documentation, and looked from the photograph to the man standing in the ballroom in a uniform jacket, and felt the air leave her lungs very slowly. Victoria Sloane told the room it was obviously some kind of theatrical stunt. Elliot told her it wasn't. He had worked at the Hartfield Grand for 7 years, long before ClearPulse was worth a conversation, and he had not arranged this evening to test anyone's character. He unclipped his radio and handed it to Dominic, who took it without a word, and Elliot's posture and tone did not change in the slightest, which, he later thought, was probably the thing that unsettled her most. He told her that what troubled him wasn't the specific things she had said. It was what those things assumed, that a uniform was a verdict, that a person's value could be read from a job title, and that someone she had decided was beneath her had no business asking questions about a contract that would govern millions of people's access to reliable power. Victoria Sloane's expression completed its journey from contempt to calculation in under a minute. She offered to add $8 million to the total agreement. She offered to have Brendan Falk issue a formal statement characterizing the evening as a misunderstanding born of the gala's chaotic environment. She suggested, with what she seemed to believe was considerable grace, that men in Elliot's position rarely encountered opportunities of this size more than once, and that she hoped he understood the value of what was still available to him. Elliot told Paul to send the formal withdrawal notice to Sloane Energy's legal office before the end of the evening. The $90 million agreement collapsed on a Saturday night, in the middle of a charity gala for rural grid access, before a single executive at the surrounding tables had fully processed what they had just witnessed. Victoria leaned close to him as she gathered her things, and told him quietly that he had made the most expensive error of his professional life, and that she would take a personal interest in ensuring ClearPulse Systems found no serious buyer for the next several years. Elliot watched her cross the ballroom toward the exit and understood that the real work was only beginning. By Sunday morning, Sloane Energy's communications team had distributed a statement to 3 business publications describing an erratic independent developer who had sabotaged a major licensing agreement at the last moment in an attempt to extract a higher payment. The coverage emphasized that Elliot worked as hotel security, which most outlets treated as relevant context rather than irrelevant detail. None of the pieces mentioned what had actually happened inside the ballroom. Brendan Falk reached out personally to 2 of ClearPulse's institutional investors before noon and told them that Elliot had thrown away their best realistic exit opportunity over a personal grudge. Dominic Ferraro's hotel began receiving 1-star reviews on every major platform by Sunday afternoon. 3 corporate clients contacted the events office to inquire about rescheduling. Dominic, who had built the Hartfield Grand over 22 years of consistent, unglamorous excellence, sat in his office that evening with a spreadsheet that told a story he had not anticipated. Elliot watched it happen with a specific kind of pain. He recognized from years of working alongside people whose livelihoods had been disrupted by failures that had nothing to do with their competence or effort. Dominic had never asked to be part of any of this. He had simply refused to pretend that one of his people had done something wrong when they hadn't. Maya noticed the change in her father across the following days. The way he read his phone at the dinner table with the stillness he usually reserved for, waiting on news he was afraid of. She did not ask him to reverse his decision. She only asked, very quietly, whether the people being hurt had chosen to be involved. It was the right question, and Elliot did not have a clean answer to it. He met with a Sloane Energy Board liaison who made the case that a personality conflict between 2 parties should not be the basis for abandoning a transaction of this economic significance. Elliot agreed with her abstractly and then asked to review the full implementation documentation Sloane Energy had submitted during due diligence, a set of files he had never been given direct access to during the negotiation process. What Paul found in those files, working through them over 2 evenings at Elliot's kitchen table while Maya slept, was the reason the deal had never been what it appeared to be. Buried in an operational addendum was Sloane Energy's actual plan for ClearPulse. It had nothing to do with improving grid reliability for underserved communities, which had been the framing surrounding the deal from the beginning. The real intention was to use ClearPulse's anomaly detection capability to identify and suppress internal data that would otherwise trigger regulatory compliance reviews. Smaller utility subcontractors would be automatically flagged by the algorithm and locked out of the system during any data irregularity, regardless of whether the fault originated with them. The protective clauses Elliot had specifically negotiated to prevent automated displacement of human infrastructure workers had been stripped from the version presented to Sloane's board and replaced with language that accomplished the opposite. Sloane Energy had wanted ClearPulse not to make the grid more honest, but to make its own dishonesty harder to detect. Elliot sat with that understanding for a long time after Paul drove home. The kitchen was quiet. The schematics on the table meant something different now than they had when he first drew them, years ago, on nights when Maya was asleep, and the apartment felt large and very silent, and he needed something precise and purposeful to keep his hands busy. He had built the platform because grids failed ordinary people who had no voice in the decisions that left them without power. The thought of it being used to bury exactly that kind of harm was not something he could locate a way to be at peace with. He did not sleep much that night, and when Maya came downstairs before sunrise and found him still at the table, she made coffee without being asked and sat beside him, without saying anything for a long time, which was more useful than anything she could have said. The situation sharpened when Paul received a call from Anna Weston on a Wednesday evening. Anna had remained with Sloane Energy's legal team through the crisis, but she was careful and methodical by nature, and what she had observed over the past week had left her unwilling to remain entirely silent. She told Paul that Brendan Falk had quietly contracted with a former ClearPulse vendor who understood enough of the platform's underlying architecture to assist Sloane's internal engineering team in reconstructing something functionally similar. The intention was to announce a proprietary competing system within 60 days, close enough to ClearPulse's design to force a costly patent dispute, calculated to drain Elliot's company of operational capital before any court could reach a verdict. When Elliot's engineers audited their development environment, they found a sequence of unusual data requests from a third-party contractor account with no legitimate reason to be in that section of the system. The requests had extracted structural diagrams from an archived early prototype, not the source code itself, but enough to provide a functional blueprint. A contractor named Drew Bassett, when approached, admitted that he had accepted a private consulting engagement without understanding who was ultimately directing it. Elliot asked him to document everything he remembered about the contact, reasoning that a cooperative witness was worth more than a quiet dismissal. Victoria held a press conference on a Thursday morning to announce that Sloane Energy had developed an internal monitoring platform that rendered the ClearPulse agreement unnecessary. She referred to Elliot publicly as a part-time security guard who had overestimated the leverage a single niche product gave him against a company of Sloane's scale. The quote spread quickly and found a ready audience. What she did not know was that Elliot's team had already found what they were looking for: an identification marker embedded in an early ClearPulse prototype years before Sloane Energy ever expressed interest, present inside Sloane's own demonstration build. The marker proved beyond technical dispute that Sloane's competing platform had been constructed from material taken from Pierce Harbor Technologies. Paul told him the technical evidence alone was not enough. They still needed proof that Victoria Sloane had personally known about the theft and authorized the use of the stolen material. What broke the situation open came from Anna Weston, who had by that point made a decision about what kind of attorney she wanted to be. She had preserved an unedited recording from an internal executive meeting, and the voice on it belonged unmistakably to Victoria Sloane, directing Brendan Falk to use the extracted ClearPulse architecture as the foundation for the competing build, and to move quickly enough that any legal challenge would arrive after the market window had already closed. The morning of the Sloane Energy Board session arrived cold and flat, the kind of autumn sky that made the city look like a photograph of itself. Elliot drove himself to the building, parked in a visitor space, and sat in the car for a moment before going in. He thought about the years of late nights that had produced what he was carrying into that room, and about Maya at her chemistry lab report, and about Dominic's spreadsheet, and about the subcontractor workers in the Sloane implementation plan who had no idea an algorithm was being designed to assign them fault they hadn't earned. He was not nervous. He was simply clear. Paul presented the evidence in sequence, without theater, beginning with the stripped protective clauses, and moving through the hidden operational addendum, the extracted architecture files, Drew Bassett's written account, the recording of Victoria directing the build, and the documentation of the coordinated review campaign against the Hartfield Grand. When Brendan Falk understood that his own account was contradicted at every point by the evidence in Paul's folder, he stopped waiting and told the room that every action he had taken had been carried out under direct instruction from the CEO's office. Anna Weston confirmed that the recording was authentic and had been preserved on the company's own secured legal server. Several board members expressed concern that losing access to ClearPulse would cost the company its primary competitive advantage in the grid modernization market. Elliot waited until the room had finished processing that concern before telling them that the question of accessing ClearPulse was no longer one the board needed to deliberate. He had signed an agreement 2 days earlier with the Meridian Grid Partners Cooperative, a network of regional utility providers jointly serving 11 states. The agreement was valued at $104 million. More importantly to Elliot, it included every protection he had originally negotiated and subsequently watched removed from the Sloane proposal. A 2-year hiring protection for infrastructure workers, a third-party audit function retained by ClearPulse over how the data was used, an appeals process for any subcontractor flagged by the system in error, and equity participation for the 6 engineers who had built the platform alongside him through every difficult year of its development. He had chosen Meridian not because the number was the highest available. He had chosen them because when he looked at what they intended to do with the technology, it matched what he had always intended it to do. The board voted to remove Victoria Sloane from the chief executive role before the session adjourned, triggering the company's for-cause provisions given the weight of what had been established. She lost her position, her unvested options, her authority over the communications team that had spent 2 weeks pursuing Dominic's reputation, and any standing to represent the company in the market where ClearPulse now belonged to someone else entirely. Brendan Falk was terminated separately and placed under a formal investigation. Victoria walked out of the boardroom with her assistant 3 steps behind her and her phone already raised to her ear, still issuing instructions to people who were no longer obligated to follow them. In the weeks that followed, Elliot compensated Dominic Ferraro for the revenue losses attributable to the review campaign and established a fund to support the Hartfield Grand's staff through the recovery period. He set aside a portion of the Meridian agreement to create a skills retraining program for grid infrastructure workers facing displacement through industry automation. He made certain that Drew Baxett's cooperation was factored into any subsequent proceedings in his favor. Dominic offered him a formal stake in the hotel, which Elliot accepted on one condition: that every employee in the building be treated by every guest as a person rather than as a feature of the decor. 6 weeks after the board session, the Hartfield Grand hosted a dinner to mark the launch of ClearPulse's deployment under the Meridian agreement. Elliot arrived in the same uniform jacket he had worn on the night the whole thing started, which he acknowledged to Dominic was probably too theatrical, and Dominic told him it was exactly the right amount. Maya came with him that evening. She stood near the entrance to the ballroom and watched her father moving through the room, and then asked him, with the tone she used when she was genuinely curious rather than making conversation, what it felt to be standing, would be standing in the same place where all of it had happened. Elliot told her it felt like the same room, which was the point. A guest at the far end of the ballroom, unaware of who Elliot was, raised a hand in the air and snapped his fingers in the direction of the nearest staff member. The table around him went quiet. The man read the room slowly, and the expression that crossed his face when he understood what he had done was not fear exactly. It was something more like sudden awareness of where he was standing and who was watching. He lowered his hand and said he was sorry. Elliot accepted it without ceremony and asked a nearby server to assist the table, and the room went back to what it had been doing, the way rooms do when something small and true has just been allowed to pass, without making a production of it. Later, after the last guests had gone and the ballroom was being cleared, Elliot and Maya walked out through the hotel's main entrance into the cool October air. She slipped her arm through his the way she had when she was much younger and walked beside him without filling the silence, and the city was quiet around them. In the way cities sometimes get late at night, when the ambient noise drops below a certain level, and you can hear your own footsteps clearly. He thought about Joanna. About how she would have found the whole story either deeply satisfying or completely ridiculous, and how the line between those two things had always been thinner than most people admitted. He thought about the platform she had never seen completed, built in the dark hours of years she hadn't lived to see, and how the hands that had written that code were the same hands that had stood post in a hotel ballroom while strangers decided what kind of people they wanted to be. He had not minded that work. He had never once minded it. And the fact that he hadn't, he thought, was precisely what Victoria Sloane had never been able to understand about him. Because she had spent so long deciding what other people were worth that she had forgotten it was never her decision to make. Maya looked up at him as they walked and said she was proud of him, not for the deal, but for not becoming something uglier than he had been at the start of it. Elliot told her that was the hardest part of anything, and the only part that actually lasted. The October sky was beginning to clear overhead, the first stars appearing in gaps between the cloud cover, and he walked beside his daughter through the quiet streets and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the ground beneath him was exactly as solid as it had always been. He had simply forgotten, for a while, to trust it.